Chapter 6. Stoics, Epicureans, and New-Platonists. The three great streams of thought flowing from the fount of ancient Greece and now irrigating the fertile mental fields of the 20th century are those to which we apply the terms Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Neoplatonism, respectively. Let us give to each of these a few moments' consideration. Now a section on Stoicism. The great school of the Stoics was founded at Athens by Zeno of Cyprus, who lived about 340 to 265 BC. The Stoic philosophy was not original, but was quite eclectic in nature, many sources having been drawn upon by it, and additions made from time to time. Starting with the fundamental conception of Heraclitus, the idea of the universal spirit of fire, ever-changing and with mind as its essence, absorbed much from Plato through Aristotle, adding much of the philosophy of the latter at the same time. The Stoic ideas changed from time to time, in minor particulars, but the general and fundamental conceptions remained much the same from first to last. The Stoics were decidedly pantheistic. As Professor Tuff says, the Stoics developed the primitive animistic theory of the cosmos in such a way as to make their conception capable of being characterized at once as pantheism and as materialism. This was effected through the conception of the Mnemona, which was, on the one hand, the all-pervading and animating spirit or life of the universe, and on the other was still a material substance, a finer air or fiery breath. In this pneuma each individual shares. Accordingly, to follow human nature means not only to follow human nature's highest principle of reason, but to conform to the all-pervading and controlling principle of the world, to the divine law or logos which characterizes the pneuma in its rational aspect. The pneuma of the Stoics and the other Greek thinkers was not air or breath, as the name might indicate, but that subtle and transcendental principle which is often expressed as spirit. This active and universal principle, this cosmic spirit, was sometimes represented by the symbol of fire, owing to its incessant motion and changing manifestations. It was also represented by the general idea of spirit, without any attempt to define that term. This spirit fire was held to be self-conscious, a great world soul, or anima mundi. It was the absolute being, God. From it emanated or appeared earth and water, ether and air, the universe of shape, form, and separate life. God was nature and nature, God. Nature was therefore rational. Life and mind were immanent and present everywhere. Every individual soul was but an expression, appearance, or emanation of the great world soul. Every soul was individualized only temporarily and would be eventually reabsorbed into the world soul at the end of the cycle of manifestation. At the day of the triumph of the universal, all-devouring fire, each cycle of differentiation was destined to end, only to be succeeded by a new one, and so on to infinity. This idea of the world soul was not new in Greek thought. The Stoics simply followed the rule of, take your own wherever you find it. Heraclitus and Anaxagoras had conceived the idea and used it under their own terms. Plato used it and, as Professor Tuff says, attempted to embody in it the opposite principles of unity and plurality, of timeless being and changing process, which he usually contrasted so sharply. It was thus a mediating conception. In the centuries to follow, in European thought, the idea was adopted by Bruno, AD 1548 to 1600, Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, and through the latter, in varying forms, by Herder, Lessing, and Goethe. Schelling was largely under its influence. Hegel and Schopenhauer embodied it in their opposing conceptions, the lead of the latter being followed by von Hartmann. Herbert Spencer narrowly escapes it in his Unknowable. Emerson recognizes it in his Oversoul. Modern science assumes it partially in its monism, and it is in evidence in the present swing to pantheism, which has attracted the attention of the thinking world. The world spirit is the essence of pantheism. It is the conception of the all in all, and all in the all, God in nature and nature in God. Naturally arising from this fundamental conception, we find the Stoic philosophy of life in connection with which the school is now chiefly known. The Stoic creed was that of resignation, almost apathy. Fate or necessity ruled the universe through unchanging law. The soul of man, being divine, should not descend to allowing itself to be affected by the passions and things of sense, nor by the changing things of the objective world. The Stoic, when told of some mighty impending calamity, said, "Well, what is that to me?" Self-control was esteemed the highest virtue. The passions were to be subordinated to reason and will. Mental disturbances, grief, worries, sorrow, and pain were but false judgments of mortal mind, and were to be overcome by true wisdom and a positive refusal to be subject to their sway. An authority says, the Stoic ethics was the ethics of apathy. The soul should not allow itself to be carried away by the passions aroused in it by external things. A man must be self-controlled. The passions are due to false judgments and mental disturbances, hence they can be overcome by wisdom and by a refusal to assent to their dictation. A man is not, indeed, master of his fate, but he can keep his self-control and proud self-complacency through all the vicissitudes of life. The Stoic ideal was a simple, natural life, for nature was divine, and to live near to her was to be more divine. Duty was derived from the laws of nature. The Stoics held that all men are brothers because of their common origin and nature, all being manifestations of the one spirit or expressions of the one oversoul. This being so, it was held that it was their manifest duty to live in brotherly love and in a spirit of mutual helpfulness. Distinctions of rank were held to be illusions and follies, and did not interfere with the social relations of the members of the school. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, was a prominent Stoic and wrote one of its classics. Epictetus, the slave, the author of the immortal discourses, was a Stoic. These two men, representing the two extremes of social rank, are perhaps the most widely known of the Stoics. This fact alone gives the Stoic idea and practice of the equality of spirit. Professor William James has said concerning the Stoic ideal, "Neither threats nor pleading can move a man unless they touch someone of his potential or actual selves. Only thus can we, as a rule, get a purchase on another's will." The first care of diplomatists and monarchs and all who wish to rule or influence is, accordingly, to find out their victim's strongest principle of self-regard, so as to make that the fulcrum of all appeals. But if a man has given up those things which are subject to foreign fate, and ceased to regard them as parts of himself at all, we are well-nigh powerless over him. The Stoic recipe for contentment was to dispossess yourself in advance of all that was out of your own power. Then fortune's shocks might rain down unfelt. Epictetus exhorts us, by thus narrowing and at the same time solidifying ourselves to make it invulnerable. I must die. Well, but must I die groaning too? I will speak what appears to be right, and if the despot says, "Then I will put yon to death," I will reply, "When did I ever tell you I was immortal? You will do your part and I mine. It is yours to kill and mine to die intrepid, yours to banish, mine to depart untroubled." How do we act in a voyage? We choose the pilot, the sailor, the hour. Afterwards comes a storm. What have I to care for? My part is performed. This matter belongs to the pilot. But the ship is sinking. What then have I to do? That which atone I can do submit to be drowned without fear, without clamor or accusing of God, but as one who knows that what is born must likewise die. This Stoic fashion, though efficacious and heroic enough in its place and time, is, it must be confessed, only possible as an habitual mood of the soul to narrow and unsympathetic characters. It proceeds altogether by exclusion. If I am a Stoic, the goods I cannot appropriate cease to be my goods, and the temptation lies very near to deny that they are goods at all. We find Till's mode of protecting the self by exclusion and denial very common among people who are in other respects not Stoics. All narrow people entrench their me, they retract it, from the region of what they cannot securely possess. People who don't resemble them, or who treat them with indifference, people over whom they gain no influence, are people on whose existence, however meritorious it may intrinsically be, they look with chill negation, if not with positive hate. Who will not be mine I will exclude from existence altogether, that is, as far as I can make it so. Such people shall he as if they were not thus may a certain absoluteness and definiteness in the outline of my me console me for the smallness of its content. The concluding portions of the above quotation are interesting, when considered in the light of certain tendencies of modern philosophical thought. In spite of Professor James's adverse comment, It is true that there is an increase of this spirit of the mental shutting out of unpleasant and unavoidable things and persons. In certain phases of the New Thought and similar movements, we find the teaching of the denial and consciousness of undesirable circumstances and persons. Professor James has stated but one side of the question. The latter-day Stoic insists upon the virtue of the opposite side. Perhaps one of the most characteristic expressions of this latter-day Stoic spirit is found in that splendid poem of Henley, which has given courage and strength to so many in their hours of trial. I think it well to reproduce it at this point, in connection with this consideration of the spirit of the Stoic philosophy. Now a poem by W. E. Henley. Out of the night that covers me, black is the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods there be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced or cried aloud. Tinder the bludgeonings of chance, my bead is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this veil of doubt and fears looms but the terror of the shade, and yet the passing of the years finds, and shall find me, unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. To those who have thought of Stoicism only in its phase of self-mastery and self-control, I would suggest a consideration of the beautiful devotional hymn to Zeus by Cleanthes, who lived about 250 BC. The legends relate that Cleanthes was a reformed pugilist, who for 17 years attended the lectures of Zeno during the day, earning his livelihood by manual labor at night. He afterward succeeded to the leadership of the school. His celebrated hymn is regarded as a classic. The following is according to the translation of Dr. James Adams, Cleanthes, Hymn to Zeus. Start of the poem. O God most glorious, called by many a name, nature's great king, through endless years the same. Omnipotence, who by thy just decree controllest all, hail, Zeus, for unto thee behoves thy creatures in all lands to call. We are thy children, we alone of all on earth's broad ways that wander to and fro, bearing thine image wheresoever we go. Wherefore with songs of praise thy power I will forth show. Lo, yonder heaven, that round the earth is wheeled, follows thy guidance, still to the copyright doth yield glad homage. Thine unconquerable hand such flaming minister, the levin brand, wieldeth, a sword two-edged, whose deathless might pulsates through all that nature brings to light. Vehicle of the universal word, that bows through all, and in the light celestial glows of stars both great and small. O King of kings through ceaseless ages, God, whose purpose brings to birth, whatever on land or in the sealess wrought, or in high heaven's immensity, save what the sinner works infatuate. Nay, but thou knowest to make crooked straight. Chaos to thee is order. In thine eyes the unloved lovely, who didn't harmonize things evil with things good, that there should be one word through all things everlastingly. One word, whose voice, alas, the wicked spurn, insatiate for the good their spirits yearn. Tet seeing see not, neither hearing hear God's universal law, which those revere. By reason guided, happiness who win. The rest, unreasoning, diverse shapes of sin, self-prompted follow. For an idle name vainly they wrestle in the lists of fame. Others inordinately riches woo, or dissolute, the joys of flesh pursue. Now here, now there they wander, fruitless still, forever seeking good and finding ill. Zeus the all-bountiful, whom darkness shrouds, whose lightning lightens in the thunder clouds, thy children save from error's deadly sway. Turn thou the darkness from their souls away. Vouchsafe that unto knowledge they attain. For thou by knowledge art made strong to reign o'er all, and all things rulest righteously. So by the honored, we will honor thee, praising thy works continually with songs, as mortals should, nor higher meed belongs e'en to the gods, that justly do adore the universal law for evermore. End of poem. To many good Orthodox folk this beautiful hymn, coming from such a decidedly heathen source, will be a revelation of the fact that the spirit of worship does not belong to any particular age or a special creed, and that, as the ancient Hindu sage has said, the truth is one, though men call it by many names. Now a section on Epicureanism. The great school of the Epicureans was founded in Athens, about 300 BC, by Epicurus, a celebrated philosopher of Samos, of whom an authority says, "He taught that the true end of existence is a species of quietism, in which the philosopher holds himself open to all the pleasurable sensations which the temperate indulgence of his ordinary appetites and the recollection of past, with the anticipation of future enjoyments, are sufficiently abundant to supply." Owing to a misrepresentation, he is generally held to have taught gross sensualism, and his name is applied to the idea of sensual enjoyments, particularly those of the table. Another authority says, "The Sisium of Epicurus and his tenets and teachings have been the subject of gross misrepresentation and dense misunderstanding. To the popular mind, the system has become the archetype of gross sensualism. In truth, Epicurus' cardinal doctrine was that the chief end of man was to be happy, and in the pursuit of that happiness, all means of pleasure or enjoyment were to be allowed. Thus, if it gave pleasure to an ascetic to starve himself and to scourge his flesh, it was as much allowable for him to pursue these methods of attaining happiness, pleasure, or peace of mind, as was the eating or drinking of the voluptuary. No matter what the choice of instruments, the end to be attained was pleasure. If one man found pleasure in books, he was as much an Epicurean. If he sought his favorite enjoyment, as was the sleek, lazy Sybarite, who passed his existence in pandering his grosser nature. Epicureanism may be briefly defined as a supreme effort at enjoyment. Epicurus taught a philosophy which was, in the end, rather a method of life than a search for ultimate truth, a moral philosophy, rather than a natural philosophy or a metaphysic. He, however, laid a basis of natural philosophy upon which to erect his philosophy of living. He favored Democritus' theory of a material universe composed of atoms, the play, action, and reaction, of the latter accounting for the phenomenal world. His idea came very close to that of the materialists of the 19th century. He believed in the gods of the Greeks, but held that they dwelt apart and separate from man, having no concern with or interest in the universe of men and things, and were therefore not to be feared. In fact, he held that the great evil of life was fear, particularly the fear of the gods and of death. The fear of the gods he disposes of as above stated. The fear of death he brushed away by the teaching that death is nothing, for when we are living and knowing, death is not. And when death is, we are not living and knowing, and likewise, where we are, death is not. Where death is, we are not. He said, good and evil are only where they are felt, and death is the absence of all feeling. He held that health of body, accompanied by tranquility of mind, represent the requisites for happiness. Pleasure, he held, is the first and great good, but he recognized pain as necessary as a background and revealer of pleasure. He also taught that many forms of pleasure were to be avoided, as they brought greater pain in their train. There was even a trace of the opposing Stoic philosophy in certain of his teachings regarding happiness and pleasure, for he said, "If thou wilt make a man happy, add not to his riches, but rather take away from his desires." He also held that the greatest happiness and pleasure arise from a compliance with virtue and honor, saying, "We cannot live a life of pleasure which is not also a life of prudence, honor, and justice, nor lead a life of prudence, honor, and justice which is not also a life of pleasure." It is one of the ironies of history that Epicurus, the teacher of a system of happiness and pleasure based upon reason, prudence, justice, honor, and virtue, should come to be popularly known as the teacher of gross sensualism and base gratification of the appetites. Nevertheless, to philosophers and students of philosophy, he is known for what he was and what he taught. His life and conduct were exemplary, and his influence operated for good. Many points of his teaching have survived, and have exerted a marked influence upon the thought of later days. Now a section on Neoplatonism, another great channel of the Platonic ideas, and one which has had a most marked influence upon the thought of the succeeding centuries, culminating in the modern revival of the old ideals of past thinkers, is that of the Neoplatonic school. Neoplatonism is the direct channel through which the thought of Plato reached Emerson and the Transcendentalists. The latter school and its great exponent freely acknowledge their indebtedness, and the connection becomes quite apparent when the two teachings are compared. Modern idealism and the inclination toward mysticism owe a similar debt, for the connection is direct and uninterrupted throughout the centuries. Neoplatonism is the great connecting link between the transcendental philosophy of ancient Greece and that of modern Europe and America. Neoplatonism is defined by Dewey as the revival and transformation of Platonic philosophy that took place, with Alexandria as its headquarters, under the influence of Oriental thought. Here the headquarters of the Oriental and the Grecian thought met and mingled, and formed a new philosophical stream which was destined to carry the bark of thought down through the centuries, into lands then unknown and undreamed of. It will be well worth our time to acquaint ourselves with its history. Neoplatonism had its original home in Alexandria, and was a phase of the Alexandrian school of philosophical thought. Professor Winley says of the Alexandrian school, it indicates that junction between Eastern and Western thought which took place at Alexandria and produced a new series of doctrines which mark an entire school. Although these tendencies may be traced as far back as 280 BC, it is convenient to date the floride of the school from 30 BC to 629 AD. The beginnings of the movement are almost lost in obscurity. Some profess to bud traces of it so early as the Septuagint 280 BC, but it is usual to date the first overt traces from Aristobulus, 160 BC. The Jewish line culminated in Philo, 40 AD, who accepted Greek metaphysical ideas and by the aid of allegorical interpretation found their justification in the Hebrew scriptures. East and West met and commingled at Alexandria. The operative ideas of the civilizations, cultures, and religions of Rome, Greece, Palestine, and the further east found themselves in juxtaposition. Hence arose a new problem, developed partly by Occidental thought, partly by Oriental aspiration. Religion and philosophy became inextricably mixed, and the resultant doctrines consequently belong to neither sphere proper, but are rather witnesses to an attempt at combining both. Neoplatonism was the expression of the philosophical side of the Alexandrian school. Lewis says that their originality consisted in having employed the Platonic dialectics as a guide to mysticism and pantheism, in having connected the doctrine of the East with the dialectics of the Greeks, in having made reason the justification of faith. By their dialectics they were Platonists, by their theory of the Trinity they were mystics, by their principle of emanation they were pantheists. Winley says, philosophically viewed, the school is eminently eclectic. Although relying upon Plato for its first principles, and especially for its dualism, it agrees with the post-Aristotelian skeptics in its contempt for knowledge, with the Stoics in its manifold tendencies toward pantheism, and in its regard for an ascetic morality. It bears traces, too, of the influence of Aristotle, especially in some aspects of its statement of the problem of the relation of God to the world. Speaking generally, it may be said that the Neoplatonists held that the basis of nature was the one, an abstract principle of unity. From this unity, the source of all things, emanated the principle of pure intelligence. From the latter emanated the world soul, or anima mundi. The world soul then manifested in the individual souls of men and animals. The later Neoplatonists went very far in asserting the divine immanence in the world soul, and consequently in the individual souls, and their conception was really that of a pantheistic idealism. Ammonius Saccas, A.D. 200, may be said to have been the father of Neoplatonism in its aspect of mysticism. He devoted great attention to the soul, explaining its nature, fall, and destiny, including the possibility and means of its returning to the state of transcendental bliss from which it originally fell. The real home of the soul, he held, was on the transcendental plane, and its only hope of happiness was to be found in a return to that plane. To be saved, the soul must rise above the world of experience and enter into the higher realm of thought and life. These mystics held, as have all other mystics, regardless of country or age, that the individual soul might rise above the world of sense experience and enter into an ecstatic condition, in which they were transported to the transcendental plane. Some called this state of ecstasy, and its result, as the union with God. Pringle Pattison says of this feature of mystic practice, penetrated by the thought of the ultimate unity of all existence and impatient of even a seeming separation from the creative source of things, mysticism succumbs to a species of metaphysical fascination. Its ideal becomes that of passive contemplation, in which the distinctions of individuality disappear, and the finite spirit achieves, as it were, utter union or identity with the being of things. As this goal cannot be reached under the conditions of relation and distinction which ordinary human thought imposes, mysticism asserts the existence of a suprarational experience in which this union is realized, such as the intuition or ecstasy or mystical swoon of the Eastern mystics, the mystical or metaphysical love of the Neoplatonists, and the gifts of the medieval saints. The same authority says, in its attempt to transcend the bounds of reason and to exalt the divine above all anthropomorphic predicates, mysticism leaves us, as in Neoplatonism, with the empty abstraction of the nameless and superessential one, the one which transcends both knowledge and existence. It is interesting to note in this connection that the revival of the ideas of Neoplatonism in modern thought has brought about a tendency on the part of certain schools of modern mystic metaphysics to revive the mystic swoon, visions, and transcendental ecstasies of the older school. The frequent modern use of the term cosmic consciousness in this connection and the numerous modern recitals of experiences of this mind show an astonishing correspondence to the union with God and ecstasy of the Neoplatonist mystics. It may be of some interest to note at this point that the Stoics had used the term cosmos as one form of expression of the world soul or anima mundi. The mysticism so noticeable in certain schools of modern popular metaphysics shows plainly its direct descent from Neoplatonism, usually through Emerson and the Transcendental movement. Plotinus, A.D. 240, was one of the most brilliant of the Neoplatonists. He was a Greek theosophist and mystic, and added to the popularity of the mystic union with God and similar transcendental beliefs and practices. Porphyry, Iamblichus, Sopater, Maximus, Plutarch, and Proclus were prominent in the school, and gave to it a decided movement away from its former philosophic aspect and toward its mystical, occult, and fantastic semi-religious aspect. Coming in contact with the rising tide of early Christianity, the movement gradually weakened, but, nevertheless, before dying out it managed to impress itself strongly upon the new religion. Many of the early fathers of the Church were strongly impressed by the Neoplatonic influence, and their writings read strangely in the light of the later theology of the Church, although closely akin to the still later writings of the mystics of the last few centuries of European thought. Clement of Alexandria and Origen, early fathers of the Church, were strongly impressed with Neoplatonism. The sect of Gnostics, which arose in the early Christian Church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Christian era, were largely influenced by the Neoplatonic teachings, especially regarding the relation of the universe to God, in which they held to the theory of emanation. Students of the early history of the Christian Church are constantly confronted with the influence of Neoplatonism, and many writers have traced the effect of the same upon the church doctrines of today. Finally driven from Alexandria and born, Neoplatonism took refuge in Athens, its original source, and was finally suppressed by Justinian in 529 A.D. But though supposedly dead and safely buried, the spirit of Neoplatonism persisted in appearing to its friends. In the 15th century, a remarkable revival of the old teachings took place. Nicholas of Cusa and other mystics found life in the old flame when the breath of interest was applied to its smoldering embers. Nicholas taught the doctrine of the possibility of divine knowledge through ecstatic states and transcendental intuition. Others, at different intervals, would bring the attention of the world to the almost forgotten doctrines. Finally, in the 17th century, there occurred that remarkable revival of Neoplatonism in England, under the influence of Cudworth and Henry More, the followers of whom became known as the Cambridge Platonists, the movement being centered chiefly at the University of Cambridge. The Cambridge Platonists were principally clergymen and scholars who had become dissatisfied with the trend of theological and philosophical thought of their day. Showing a strong tendency toward mysticism, idealism, and a modified pantheism, they soon formed an important school of thought of their time. Plato, the Neoplatonists, especially Plotinus, Descartes, Malebranche, and Boehme, the mystic philosopher, were their principal sources of thought and inspiration. Cudworth postulated the existence of a plastic nature which was akin to the demiurge or world soul of the Greeks, although he held that it was a working instrument and aid to God, rather than God himself. More presented a subtle and fascinating doctrine of mysticism. The movement attracted many men of note and distinction, both to its inner circle and to its affiliated schools of general sympathizers. Traces of its influence still exist in English literature and philosophy. It may interest the reader to have presented to him the idea of plastic nature, as advanced by Ralph Cudworth, A.D. 1617–88. The English Neo-Platonist, particularly as the detailed teaching is seldom met with in works upon the subject. Cudworth, it seems not so agreeable to reason that nature, as a distinct thing from the deity, should be quite superseded or made to signify nothing, God, himself, doing all things immediately and miraculously. From whence IB would follow also that they are all done either forcibly and violently, or else artificially only, and none of them by any inward principle of their own. This opinion is further confuted by that slow and gradual process that in the generation of things, which would seem to be but a vain and idle pomp or a trifling formality if the moving power were omnipotent, as also by those errors and bungles which are committed where the matter is inept and contumacious, which argue that the moving power be not irresistible, and that nature lost such a thing is not altogether incapable, as well as human art, of being sometimes frustrated and disappointed by the indisposition of matter, whereas as omnipotent moving power, as it could dispatch its work in a moment, so would it always do it infallibly and irresistibly, no ineptitude and stubbornness of matter being ever able to hinder such a one, or make him bungle or fumble in anything. Wherefore, since neither all things are produced fortuitously, or by the unguided mechanism of matter, nor God himself may be reasonably thought to do all things immediately and miraculously, it may well be concluded that there is a plastic nature under him, which, as an inferior and subordinate instrument, doth drudgingly execute that part of the providence which consists in the tegular and orderly motion of matter. Yet so as there is also besides this a higher providence to be acknowledged, which, presiding over it, doth often supply the defects in it, and sometimes overrules it, forasmuch as the plastic nature cannot act electively nor with discretion. The reader will recognize in this conception of plastic nature a successor of the universal flame of Heraclitus and the will to live of the Buddhists, as well as a predecessor of the will of Schopenhauer, von Hartmann, and Nietzsche, and the life forces of Bernard Shaw, with this difference, that in these conceptions nature and God are identified, instead of being considered as coexistent. Cudworth anticipated Schopenhauer's objection that when one identifies God with nature, he really shows God to the door. For a self-existent nature is a no less thinkable proposition than a self-existent God manifesting as nature. Cudworth, a conception is interesting not only by reason of its quaint presentation, but also as a notable attempt to bridge the chasm between theism and pantheism. It deserves greater recognition than is generally accorded it by modern writers on the history of philosophy.